you for being here. Before I introduce the program, I would like to remind you that tomorrow there are a whole series of activities, particularly at 3 there is going to be a ceremony at the memorial by journalists who are going to be putting wreaths in front of the memorial, and there will be a short talk by an Italian journalist called Beppe Giulietti. At 3 o'clock at Bitnia, there will be the wreath-laying ceremony, and then at 6 o'clock there will be the Mass at St. Francis Church in Valletta, and at 7 o'clock we start walking down to the memorial, and it is very important that we make a statement, that people are there, because this government only understands when they see people. If they don't see people, they just couldn't care less. And I think there are so many issues at the moment that we are fighting for, that it is important that people are there. So please encourage your friends and your families to come. As you know, these events, plus our court case, which we started last week, cost a serious amount of money. So there is a crowdfunding initiative going on at the moment, and we are practically begging you, please contribute and get people to contribute, or we're going to be seriously broke. So after that appeal, I now have the great pleasure of introducing our Dutch speaker, Peter Omstkids. He is a man with a colourful political life. He was a member of parliament from 2003 to 2025, and he started his parliamentary career as a member of the Christian Democratic Appeal, but then he shifted to an independent, and in August 2023 founded his own party, the New Social Contract, which perhaps was a callback to the foundations of democratic thought as laid by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He had the courage to declare burnout in April 2025 and quit politics. Mr. Omskit is a militant for truth and justice, for human rights, and for the rights of minorities. And in his country, he is very well known to have denounced the child care benefits scandal, which brought down the Rutte government, and which reminds us of the benefits scandals that we have ourselves experienced in Malta, which up to now have gone unpunished, and which Jason had denounced. He was a member of the Dutch delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and that is how he got involved with Malta. As a member of this Dutch delegation, he was the rapporteur for mass surveillance and the protection of whistleblowers. You know that the law for whistleblowers in Malta is practically rubbish. He was a rapporteur.
No, it is rubbish.
He was rapporteur, and this is how he got involved with Malta, because he was the rapporteur in the case of the assassination for Daphne Caruana Galizia. And the way he spoke up for freedom and against corruption in Malta gave us a lot of strength and a lot of courage to pursue our fight for justice. He was a great supporter of ours. So it is with great pleasure that I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Vicky Ann. Dear Corinne and Elena, good seeing you here. Dear Miss Ambassador, dear members of Republica, it's an honor for me to give a lecture to commemorate her work, the achievements and the legacy of Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta and in Europe. I'm still struggling with the Maltese language, but I'll get around it. Few journalists in Europe have left such a remarkable legacy by exposing truth, speaking truth to power, and in general, investigate and to shine with the brightest flashlights possible on the eyes of those who consistently chose to work as much as possible in the shade. It's a bit strange for me to hold this lecture or this talk, as you understand. Not only have I been home for a few months, but all of you in this room have known her, and I may actually be the only one who has never met her. Yet, through her work and through the contact with her family, I do have a clear picture of her work, her ideals, and what she uncovered in Malta. She knew that telling the truth hurts, as she was very much on the receiving end of the threats. But telling the truth hurts more than telling lies, and that's what she did. And it's important in a free society. It's actually essential in a society to be free. Or as George Orwell wrote in his unpublished foreword to Animal Farm, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. Well, there's a lot people do not want to hear in this country. And looking around Malta today, there's a group of people who still do not want to hear the truth. In most society, if a member of the society is assassinated, people come together, honor the victim, and publicly ascertain that whatever the differences of opinion, that whatever the differences of opinion, that whatever the argument, it is completely wrong to kill any member of society, whatever you think. And usually you erect a statute, you name a room in parliament, or you have an important prize nominated to her. None of this happened in Malta voluntarily. And that is very telling. It's very telling that to find such a room, you need to go to the European Parliament. To go to find a statute, you have to go outside of Valletta, as much as possible from the ministries of this country. And to find a prize, you have to go to Brussels. It's very honorable, but they should be here. They should not be there. It might be, and so 8 years after the assassination, we still haven't reached the point that there is some common memory. And those things do not happen in other countries, with the exception of Russia. So when the Italian Prime Minister was assassinated, as you know, in the 1980s, no one said he should have been assassinated. And he was publicly honored. When a politician was murdered in my country, he was quite right-wing. Everyone said this is not the way we're dealing with it. When she was, it appears that it remained silent. It might be that the conscience of a number of people is hurting quite a bit, and they don't dare making public statements. In all honesty, after 22 years in politics, I'm not really convinced every politician has a conscience or a working spine or a loving heart, for that matter. If anything, the lack of common public recognition for Daphne is a sign that the truth hurts so much that it's still unbearable. During my political life, and especially during my research in Malta, my mind often wandered back to the days I had to study Dante's Divine Comedy. Well, talking about theatres, Dante Alighieri has a clear notion of truth, if you read his work. And during his passage through hell, we see sinners getting the most horrific, eternal torments. And in Canto 21, there's a very special place in hell for the barattieri. Baratteria is a medieval Italian term that can be translated as graft, abuse of public office for personal gain, or more broader, fraud committed to obtain illicit gains to the detriment of one's community. The perpetrators, these barattiers, are punished in a boiling pitch of tar, symbolizing the sticky, corrupt nature of their political dishonesty. Dante writes how the demons push these Dante writes how these demons push these corrupt politicians under with hooks. And it's a comparable of how a cook actually cooks his dish. It's not by chance that Dante was so harsh for this group. Corruption was rife in 14th century Florence. Dante himself held a number of public offices, and in the year 1300 he was prior for a number of months. In 1302, the Black Guelph faction took power, and Dante, member of the White Guelph faction, was condemned to exile for corruption. Charging someone with corruption was often a way of eliminating political opponents in those days. Dante never returned to Florence. He died in exile in Ravenna in 1321. His writings are very, very loud on corruption in both the city government and corruption in the Catholic Church. By the way, the remorse in Florence is still large. Every year they send a bottle of olive oil to Ravenna, and they have a tomb built in the Santa Croce church, which was the biggest church before Brunelleschi built the Duomo. And for 700 years they've been begging to repatriate Dante. And they had the support of popes, the support of Michelangelo, and anyone they could find of. But they failed miserably. In Ravenna they say, you ousted him, so you don't get him back. Corruption is often rooted in the political structure and the political institutions. Change in institutions is necessary to slowly eradicate practices and change attitudes. This is a slow, difficult and continuous process which never ends. It's not by chance that the last post of Daphne was, there are crooks everywhere you look. The situation is desperate. The situation today is not much better, according to the Maltese population, not according to me. It may even be worse. The Eurobarometer surveyed citizens' attitudes towards corruption in 2025 in all EU countries. The outcomes for Malta are downright miserable. 89% of Maltese citizens believe the problem of corruption is widespread in Malta. That must be the majority of every political party. 52% of Maltese citizens, the majority, tells that corruption personally affects their daily lives. 9% of Maltese citizens had personally experienced or witnessed a case of corruption in the last year. If you've got 500,000 citizens, that's 45,000 citizens who saw corruption firsthand. And 23% of Maltese citizens personally know someone who takes or has taken bribes. When asked why corruption is not brought to the police, there are three top reasons in Malta. First, there's no protection from retaliation for those who report corruption, including in the work context. That has something to do with your new whistleblower legislation, which is just as bad as the old one. Reporting it would be pointless because those responsible will not be punished. Anyone who's done any court case in Malta and know the length of times knows it's impossible. And those who report cases get into trouble with the police or with other authorities. That's a particularly nasty reason. These are answers given freely by Maltese citizens. It's not a malicious foreigner, as I've been portrayed by some in this country, but it's what Maltese tell themselves. More than half of them say it affects their daily lives. My country has quite a number of failings, and it will become more apparent by the day. But that figure in my country is 11%. Things can be different. And these figures go to the heart of the support for Daphne and the shyness to admit that there is a problem. Or more clearly, Daphne was right, Daphne is right, and I hope in the future she will be wrong. She uncovered the corruption of Panamese companies held by ministers and government officials. And Transparency International places Malta on place 26 out of 27 EU countries on the Corruption Perception Index, with a continuous decline over the last 10 years. The state of Malta. In a state, checks and balances between state powers are absolutely essential. Checks and balances, we're going, you get your French once. Montesquieu was very clear on that in De l'Esprit des Lois. Pour qu'on ne puisse abuser du pouvoir, il faut que, par la disposition des choses, le pouvoir arrête le pouvoir. Or to prevent the abuse, it's necessary, from the very nature of things, that power should be checked, should be a check to power. You can be very clear which power we mean. In modern politics, we obviously have the three powers: the executive, the legislative, and the justice system, but it's always, almost always, the executive which overrules the two other powers. And that's exactly what's happening in Malta. I tried to figure that when I wrote my report. This is, and I'm sorry it's in such small print, what the Prime Minister at that time, Joseph Muscat, was able to do. So he could nominate the Chief Justice, he could appoint the Chief Justice, judges, magistrates, here the Police Commission, the Police Government Board, the Secret Services, then could do the same with the Permanent Commission Against Corruption, nominated by Muscat, very well done. Internal Audit and Investigation Department, Broadcasting Authority, Public Service Commission, Electoral Commission, Persons of Trust, of which you had a whole lot in this country, the Data Protection Commission and the Malta Financial Service Authority. And also, and this is really interesting, appoints the ministers, the Attorney General, that's obviously changed a bit, that office, the permanent secretaries. I know no other countries in which the Prime Minister actually on his own does this. Usually the ministers do have a say, and the Principal Permanent Secretary. How powerful do you want to be? And how vulnerable do you want to be as a country if you leave this in one hand? If you get the wrong person into this office, you've got a problem. So from the outset, the problem in Malta is larger than the problem, for instance, in the United States, but there are a bit more checks and balances to start off with. Someone is trying to destroy a few of those checks and balances, but there are more in the Constitution of the United States. And what then happens that the Prime Minister has the arrows going outward, Daphne had the arrows going inward. Here we see 47 libel suits. Mr. Muscat, Mr. Schembri. Now he dropped his, I think, because the truth was too painful for him to discuss in court. Mr. Mitzi, Mr. Cardona. I'll come back to all three of those because they didn't want to talk to me. Henley and Partners and Pilatus Banks were after her, frozen the assets, and she filed a report 15 days before the assassination, and we've got various incidents, a front door set alight, setting tires alight at home. The problem is, who is controlling whom? If you keep a society in which the government controls the media, and it controls the media which is dependent, and it controls the media which is independent, then you have a serious problem. I can go you through at least 10 citations of all the founding fathers of the United States and about every philosopher I can find on the importance of free media and to destroy free media if you want to destroy democracy. It's the first thing you need to make sure you do not have. And that's the importance of this assassination. When the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe adopted its resolutions on Malta in 2019, I wrote that a fundamental, holistic reform is required in Malta. The report listed the weaknesses: the Prime Minister, the absence of independent policing and prosecution, a part-time parliament, to which I return in a second, that is totally unable to restrain the executive, and institutions of oversight that existed more in form than in function. 6 years later, there have been a few changes. Much of the substance is still the same. Some of the forms have been repainted, but the foundations remain just as fragile as they were 8 years ago. The government of Malta has enacted a number of constitutional amendments, partly inspired by the Venice Commission advice. Judges and magistrates are now appointed through a judicial appointment committee rather than directly by the Prime Minister, and that's a good thing. The police commissioner is chosen through a public call. You remember how many police commissioners Muscat went through in the year before the assassination. And the Attorney General has been separated from the State Advocate's Office. That was absolutely necessary and long overdue. On paper, these are very welcome. Yet every international review from Greco to the European Commission Rule of Law report show us that the spirit of the reform has not kept pace with the letter. Political discretion, opacity and dependence continue to define the system. Take, for instance, the judiciary. Appointment procedures remain vulnerable to influence through political bullying of judges and magistrates that take decisions that are inconvenient to a ruling party. And there's a wider context to those manifest outrages of just judicial independence. The judiciary's workload is overwhelming and its resources insufficient. Backlogs persist that effectively deny justice. Hundreds of criminal cases still await assignment, and even the Chief Justice has publicly warned that the courts cannot fulfill their constitutional duty without reform of procedure and investment in staff and technology. Justice delayed is still today justice denied. And the prosecution system remains a hybrid creature. The Attorney General, despite being free from the conflict of interest inherent in its old function of acting as the government's legal advisor, retains its apparent inability to act in a way that the government might perceive to be against the interests of the individuals who run the government. The prosecutorial service remains under-resourced and lacks specializations, particularly in the fight it should be prosecuting against corruption. Greco already noted in 2018 that the police and the Attorney General's office suffer from a culture of inertia. When confronted with corruption by powerful figures. That assessment sadly still stands today. The major corruption cases of the past decade, Electrogas, Vital's Global Healthcare, Pilatus Bank, have yielded very little accountability. Magisterial inquiries continue behind closed doors for years. And when the task passes to the prosecution service, the national effort appears to be focused on shielding the powerful rather than exposing them. Instead of building alliances with civil society and the free press in a national effort to combat corruption, the Maltese authorities appear to suffocate transparency, and it appears an intentional act. Malta's media environment, and sometimes I was very happy I did not understand Maltese while I was here when they talked about me, remains one of the most distorted in Europe. Political parties continue to own and control national broadcasters, effectively using public frequencies as partisan instruments. The state broadcaster lacks editorial independence, and proposed media reform bills have been drafted without genuine consultation with journalists or civil society. The European Commission has urged Malta to adopt robust anti-SLAPP protection and to guarantee access to information. Yet, the Freedom of Information Act still allows the administration to obstruct requests on the flimsiest of grounds possible. Journalists face online harassment and costly litigation, What promised protections for whistleblowers remains ineffective, and I'll return to that in a second. 8 years after Daphne's death, the environment for investigative journalism in Malta is not safer. In some way, it's even colder. But to give you but one example of that way, that's a new restriction to the NGOs face, civil society faces, the campaigners face, when they go to court and want to activate judicial inquiries into alleged crimes, which the police consistently ignores. It is tragic that it's now harder in Malta, after the so-called reform, to deal with corruption in the senior ranks of its government than it was when Daphne was still alive. Some of the high-profile cases which did make it to court and which did make sure that ministers were arraigned only got there because of the efforts of civil society. And the restrictions, especially the restriction on the burden of proof, is an effective deterrent to using this one effective instrument which Malta still had. Parliament remains incredibly weak. Members of Parliament are still part-time and poorly paid, leaving them dependent on government appointments and contracts. This means that most government MPs are either a minister or have a very lush government contract. And in a democracy, the backbenchers on the government side are actually the most important ones, because they at some point shout no to a government. But if you make sure you have no backbenchers on the government side that can shout no, which is still the case in Malta, then you're pretty sure you can continue indefinitely. And you can do better. You can go to Luxembourg. You can go to Iceland, where MPs are full-time paid, where there are rules on the kinds of jobs they can do. And the simple fact that Parliament still hasn't faced up to it means that it doesn't understand its role in a society. And I would have loved to see a number of MPs, I'll come back to that, how my conversations, fights is a better word of litigation, with these MPs were. Parliamentary oversight of the present committees is extremely timid. Committee scrutiny is minimal, and political and personal loyalty outweigh the duty of the public. And if another party gets to power, please start changing that system. Please start that the minority can start an investigation into what the government is doing. You also have to allow it when you are in the majority, I say to some. You can do so, not in the Netherlands, by the way, we have the same problem. When I was in opposition, I could not start an investigation because you need a majority in parliament. But parliaments like France or Norway have that a quarter, or Germany, have that a quarter or a third of the MPs can actually start investigating without permission of the executive. That's what you have a loyal opposition for. If it means that you can effectively govern and block every information with 51% of the MPs, the majority plus one, you really do not have a functioning democracy. Meanwhile, the damning findings and investigation of oversight institution, the Ombudsman, the Auditor General, the Standards Commissioners, continue to accumulate without consequence. The Standards Commissioner in particular has been repeatedly undermined, his terms allowed to lapse amid political dispute, and the requirement of political consensus on choosing successors to the post abolished. The message is clear. Accountability is tolerated only when it is harmless. The European Commission 2025 Rule of Law reports notes some progress in establishing internal procedures for judicial appointment and in preparing a whistleblower's office. I do not agree with the last bit too much, but then again, the European Commission always finds good spots, even on Greek finances. But it also regards continued concerns regarding the effectiveness and independence of law enforcement and delays in implementing recommendations of public inquiries. The Commission warns that trust in the institution remains low, which is hardly surprising because, as the Commission observes, Malta remains completely free of a record of conviction in cases of high-profile corruption. Public perception has picked up on this, as we noted in the Eurobarometer. A majority now thinks that corruption level have increased in the past 3 years. This is not cynicism. This is the experience of society, where accountability is the exception and not the rule. Civil society tries filling the gap, and civil society is strong in Malta, and that's a plus. Organizations like yours, like Republica, and journalists who continue Daphne's work have documented the unfinished reforms. They point to the need of an anti-mafia and anti-racketeering legislation, to reform party financing, to transparency in prosecutorial decisions, and to the social issue of reuse of confiscated assets. They've called for constitutional renewal to rebalance the separation of powers and to an end to the commodification of citizenship, the selling of passports. Well done, Malta. You made it to the White House. The proposals are detailed and practical. What is missing is political will. In this sense, the problem is not a technical problem of legislation. It's a problem of moral orientation. Malta's institutions still operate within a political culture that values loyalty over legality, expedience over duty, and silence over truth. The Venice Commission has reminded us that the rule of law is not only a structure of rules, it's a culture of restraint. Where power remains unchecked, rules alone cannot ensure justice. Where truth is negotiated, freedom cannot breathe. The result is also slow reform of backsliding, not through an open defiance of democratic norms, not through a sort of January 6th insurrection as we've seen in some other country, but a quiet, slow but sure dissolution of norms without observing it. Sometimes there is a little bit of diluted progress. The anti-SLAPP laws, implementing EU legislation inspired by the very case of Daphne, but then Malta chooses not to apply them domestically and says that's our own business, which technically, by the way, it is, because the European Union has not got the power to do it. But it's a huge failure, because it still means that journalists are under the threat of SLAPPs. And worse even, I find it truly incredible that the family of Daphne to this day has to defend the SLAPP cases left by the people 8 years ago. It is extremely painful to watch the process and to see some litigation against the Caruana family continue as much as possible, to inflict pain and to obfuscate the truth. The whistleblower legislation is also implemented in a manner as just to leave a few loopholes, that whistleblowers are not secure in Malta. This legislation I know extremely well because I wrote 2 reports on whistleblowers for the Council of Europe. I was heard as an expert in the European Parliament for this particular legislation, and they followed part of my advice. And sadly, I must admit, Malta did not implement it properly. As I noted, the private and public sector whistleblowers units do not provide the necessary guarantees of independence and absence of conflict of interest. Barriers in access to the organizational leadership prevent whistleblowers' information from getting into the right hands, which is after all the main purpose of whistleblower protection. And the loophole in the definitions effectively places a high burden of proof on the whistleblower, as protection is denied whenever a negative action is, quote, justifiable for administrative organizational reasons, whether or not it is retaliatory. If you leave this kind of loopholes in your law, you're pretty sure that in the most important cases, whistleblowers will be left out in the dark if they really need the support. and it passed the Maltese parliament without any proper discussion. This is not as it should be. And prosecution of high-profile politicians charged with corruption are themselves a bit transformed in trying to discredit journalists and activists. Reforms become procedural, and the memory of a journalist's murder seems to be fading for some, or at least that is want to. It's not that democracy is collapsing, it's a very slow erosion. And this erosion, this corrosion, is more dangerous because it happens in silence. To sum up, we still have an extremely weak parliament. If you want to spend some extra money, start paying your MPs. Please. It saves you an enormous amount in the long term. You cannot pay your MPs less than an ordinary worker's salary and expect them to work full-time as an MP. Don't. So what happens? It is the open loophole which you can close with an instant. And I know it's difficult for politicians to say, raise the salary of politicians, but please do. There is an alternative, and that is to make sure that ministers cannot sit in parliament. That would also solve something. If a relatively small parliament, and more than half of the people on the government benches are ministers themselves, you know that the ministers themselves will never vote against their own government. So the system isn't big enough. So either you enlarge parliament, and I can understand you don't want to do that, or you make sure you keep the ministers out. Just failed to mention that the thing on the whistleblowers legislation, I gave you the technique, but you didn't need the technique. Because you saw in the Eurobarometer that it was, particularly in Malta was different from all the other countries, that they knew that whistleblowers are never protected. So the public doesn't read laws. Actually, not all MPs read all the laws, is my experience. But they understand exactly how the laws work. My role in Malta. Since my job as a rapporteur and as a member of the Parliamentary Assembly on the Council of Europe has now officially ended, I feel a bit more liberty to openly tell you about my experience and my feelings during my work in Malta. I usually try to keep up appearances as much as possible. I hold a record of 21 reports and opinions in 20 years in the Parliamentary Assembly. That means that on top of my work as a full-time, and by the way, well-remunerated MP in the Netherlands, I consider this work to be important and valuable. In my view, it's impossible to have deep economic European integration, economic and on values, without a continuous dialogue and discussion over the common values and the measures. And I just mentioned the passports in passing. If Malta sells passports, and actually has a nice film which shows mountains in it, which means I haven't found them in Malta yet, so probably were meant that you can buy a passport and then immediately move to Austria or something. So you get the millions and Austria gets the crooks. That's very interesting, you can do that. Then you have to have this discussion. The same with the gaming authority. The gaming industry and the industry in which the gambling industry in this country is just causing a lot of havoc in the rest of the EU. Now, my country is not free of it. We do have certain tax break in which we make sure that the work is done elsewhere and the tax credits come to the Netherlands. And we need a public discussion on those things continuously, otherwise we make policies. And by the way, I forgot to put it in here because it was too difficult. The gaming industry was in the hands of the Prime Minister. The selling of passports was in the hands of Prime Minister. And if you earn quite a lot of money in there, that's not by accident. Fortunately, not all my reports were as difficult as this one. Otherwise, I would have quit politics a lot earlier. My family life at home with 4 daughters also needs a bit of real time and especially also real attention. But the reports with Vladimir Karamurza on Russia, and you know he was a prisoner over there, and he was twice poisoned and almost died, and the third time he was put in a cell in Siberia. And I still wrote the reports with him on Putin while he was in prison. The report on the IS genocide of the 7 years in which I had discussion with the supervisors, with the survivors, and on the rule of law in Poland were pretty heavy assignments as well in the Council of Europe. The Malta assignment strangely stood out. Because without hesitation I can say that the report on the assassination of Daphne and the rule of law in Malta has been about as difficult and as acrimonious as all the other 20 reports combined. And it cost me a lot of stress. That was making sure that an independent and external investigation was set up to investigate corruption, and I wasn't doing this. It wasn't the only difficult project. I had three difficult things going on at the same time. So you mentioned that because of the investigation I did together with one or two other MPs in the Netherlands, the government of the Netherlands came down. Benefit scandal, which meant that tens of thousands of families were completely destitute, lost everything. I had one particular other acrimonious things, and in a second you'll understand why this is important. The Council of Europe itself had been corrupted by Azeris. They were paying money, expensive gifts like jewelry, other kinds of gifts to men, which I rather not mention, to MPs. And in exchange for them, a lot of MPs voted in favor of Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan could still claim it was a democracy because it wasn't condemned too much by the Council of Europe. Now Azerbaijan has had two presidents since its independence of the Soviet Union and dissolution of the Soviet Union. A father and his son. And they also have a vice president, and that's because that son nominated his wife to become vice president. And it passes through for a democracy. It gets worse. Azerbaijan had a claim on Nagorno-Karabakh. And Azerbaijan waged war against Armenia and managed to ethnically clean Nagorno-Karabakh of 120,000 ethnically Armenians without a large outcry internationally. If you corrupt politicians, it has real effects. I was the one who did not only table a motion on Daphne, but also tabled a motion to have a surprise, surprise, independent and external investigation in the Council of Europe against corruption. I knew, or at least I thought I knew, that that would be the end of my political career. Because not only was my present party chairman involved, also the party chairman before that, and the party chairman before that had become the president of the assembly. The committee chairman on legal affairs, where I wrote the report, was involved. And I could not kick them out because otherwise I could not have done my work. In the end, these 13 people who were no longer an MP were banned for life from the premises of the Council of Europe. And 4 present MPs got sentences from 2 to 10 years in which they basically could not do work. That was the maximum they could do under the statute. We still have court cases running against some of them, including my then party chairman. One of them got a prison sentence. Now you imagine how much fun it is to actually declare that your chairman actually is corrupt. It doesn't give you a lot of fun. So having this together with Malta and together with thing does lead to a kind of burnout. How did it go here? Well, during my visit to Malta, it was determined that I needed 24/7 police protection. And the Maltese government insisted that they were to provide the protection. So here I was doing an investigation into the rule of law of Malta, which I knew was failing. and the Maltese state said, we are doing the protection. I have to say the people who did it professionally, so I've got no complaints. But it did not make me feel more secure. The attacks by the Maltese government was something I had not experienced before. Not with Russia, not with Azerbaijan, not even when intervening on whistleblowers. Though I have one thing with Edward Snowden when I needed to hear him. There was animosity, disagreement, and downright hostility on many levels. The very word assassination in the title of the report was even challenged in 2019 because it was politically loaded. Let that sink in for a moment. A year and a half after the assassination, the government, by mouth of Kurt Farrugia, then the spokesman, had not come to terms with the fact that it was an assassination. What else did the government of Malta think that a car bomb on broad daylight on a famous journalist would be? They never offered an alternative word, and they did not put forward an amendment to change the title. But just by the very fact that they were even challenging that it was an assassination showed that they never made any step. And the Maltese government publicly described my report as riddled with inaccuracies and gratuitous statements. Well, they were pushed several times. List the inaccuracies by many journalists. They could not find a single factual errors in all the 26 pages. And I would put them on the wall, and especially the conclusion about the failings in the investigation and the failings in the Maltese state, that they were not able to tell me one thing that was wrong. And several important people refused to meet me. Keith Shembri, Conrad Mitzi, Chris Cardona. They did not even reply to my request to answer a few questions in writing. And later on, they all complained that I was not open to dialogue. Mr. Emmanuel Malia was the head of the delegation. He tabled a motion to withdraw my mandate, a motion of no confidence. Something I had never experienced before and never seen before in the Council of Europe. Of course without success. He tabled amendments on about every important line of the resolution, trying to weak every conclusion. There was no dialogue, there was denial. By the way, he failed on all of them. Ms. Rojana Kutajar was very eloquent in a reaction to my report. She just failed to declare that she had a business relationship, or so I was told, with Mr. Fenech, who was mentioned in my report as the owner of the infamous 17 Black. She was found to be in serious breach of the rules of the Council of Europe, and that's exceptional. She resigned, so she could not receive a punishment. No measures were taken. The amendments, which were tabled by Mr. Malia and co-signed by Ms. Kutajar and other Maltese MPs, were also signed by several Azeri MPs. Mind you, this was while the scandal was out in the open, while you have 47 countries where you can get signatures, you need 5 signatures. There's one office you don't go to. That's the Azeri office. That's what they did. So it sort of strengthened during the Caviar Gate that Malta didn't mind having a relationship with the Azeri delegation. My Wikipedia page was altered from an IP address of the Maltese Ministry of Education to include the slanderous allegation that I had paid for fake evidence in order to put the blame on Ukraine and exonerate Russia in the MH17 downing. Now, try that one on me. UK company Chelgate called to Strasbourg to inquire about my report, talking about worst case scenarios. They have probably been paid for by the Maltese government, who didn't want to officially confirm this in questions of Jason at your party. And all the while I was writing this report, I have written letters, stacks of letters for inquiries, but a second stack of letters in a reply to every allegation that was made to me. None of them stood up. There was no dialogue on the rule of law of problems in Malta. And the government just kept emphasizing in my report without understanding them and without realizing the irony of them. So if you read the statement of Castilla on my report, it says, the Maltese government MPs are making a case as forcefully as possible to the Parliamentary Assembly. They didn't even deny that there was no separation of powers at all, and that the Maltese government MPs, but by the way are government MPs, they can be coalition MPs, but they're not MPs from the government, but they didn't even keep up the appearances. You may expect me to now mention the famous entry sign of Dante, because you're all down. Lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate, which translates into abandon all hope, you enter here. It's written great on when in the, I think it's the third canto, he enters hell together with Virgil. And that's a sign to those in hell. And in hell you find the corrupt politicians. It's not the sign for people who are fighting corruption. It's a telling sign that the action of one of the very courageous and determined women shook the foundations of the government and the whole establishment in Malta. She's exceptional, and it shows her strength, but it also shows the extreme weaknesses of the foundations of the Maltese state, if one person is able to do that. I see hopeful stories, signs. The stories in Revelations did not fade away, thanks to the work of many journalists and thanks to the family of Daphne. And there were also internationally some hopeful signs. There may be an international court of corruption, which is being set up in The Hague and which we're trying to work on hard. And that may be necessary in this kind of cases. But I see also desperation. Desperation on the part of those who did not agree with her in life, even after an assassination, which you would not want to happen to the worst of your enemies, as the saying goes. They could still not agree on this national monument. And I hope that next time I will come back, they will at least, in name, honor her. Some people are trying to eradicate Daphne from public memory by clearing up the Great Seats monuments on a daily basis. That's where they try to clear their own memories, not the public memories. And I do admit, Malta is not alone. In a lot of Western countries, there's an enormous amount of backsliding. Backsliding in criminal cases and backsliding in democracy. And sometimes backsliding in both. And unfortunately, it's accelerating. Malta is no longer the exception. But Malta has always been pretending it's not happening. Pretending that Malta is fighting corruption. The nicest example I found was the conference, the international conference on the London Summit, sorry, misspelling there, the London Summit, called by David Cameron in 2016. And Joseph Muscat was there. And he signed the most incredible text. This is the preface. We commit to expose corruption wherever it is found, to pursue and punish those who perpetrate, facilitate, or are complicit to it, to support the communities who have suffered from it, and to ensure it does not fester in our government institutions, business, and communities. We will fulfill our shared commitment to substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms. It goes on. The first slide says corruption should be exposed, ensuring there is nowhere to hide. By ending the misuse of anonymous companies to hide the proceeds of corruption. At that point, these companies were known. Just their owners were known. By driving out those lawyers, real estate agents and accountants who facilitate or are complicit in corruption and denying the corrupt the use of legitimate business channels. By increasing the transparency of government budgets. By making it easier for people to report corruption without fear of reprisal. Second slide, the corrupt should be pursued and punished, and those who have suffered from corruption fully supported. By actively enforcing anti-corruption laws and working together to pursue the corrupt, prosecute and punish them. And the third slide, I'm not going to read everything because it would take me all night. It's actually a 9-page, line-by-line thing what they are going to do. And 2-page addendum on what Malta is going to do by its own. You'll enjoy reading it. Corruption should be driven out wherever it may exist. And you laugh about them, but these are official government statements, also on behalf of the Maltese government. And the Maltese government can just be kept to it, by its own MPs or by its international partners. And they should be kept to these promises. They should be asked, nagged, and asked again every day. And where does my hope come from? Well, I spent 7 of my most beautiful years in Italy. Not only was I exposed to beautiful arts and beautiful theaters, by the way, a rich history, a nice language, which I still find hard to understand. Yeah, I laugh about it, but my wife is Arab as her mother tongue, so together we may give it a try. And something very important, the literature, like Divina Commedia. But also to a country reinventing itself. There is 89% of Malta today who is totally fed up with corruption. The public in Italy was fed up, the public at large was fed up with corruption and with politicians. And it only took a few brave prosecutors, first on the mafia, and yes, some paid a high price. Falcone, Borsellino were assassinated with car bombs. But in the end, there were large trials for the mafia. And then the unlikely happened. They managed to go after former prime ministers, after lots of MPs, after businessmen. Tangentopoli was only driven by a few prosecutors in Milan. It did not take the whole society. It just took a small group with the backing of society, with the full backing of the law, and the law was on their side, to actually change the Italian society. Would it be possible to achieve change in Malta? I was asked many times, expecting that I would say, no, nothing is possible. I would not have thought that it had been possible to actually solve the scandal I saw in the Netherlands. I never thought that a number of ministers would have been arraigned in court. I did not think those things would happen. And as you know in history, things are only normal when they have happened. No one here fighting the Great Siege thought Malta would win. If there were newspapers in those days, everyone thought that was a lost war. Still, Malta made it with great consequences. This war could be won in the very, very same way. You have to fight corruption effectively. You stand up for your values, and you have to find new alliances. And those alliances have to be found across a fractured society. You have to make the plans, and the laws have to be ready. This is the one thing you can learn from Trump. Everything was ready before he came to office. Many people fail to do so when they come to office. They enjoy being in office too much. But to speak with one of the predecessors of David Cameron, we were in office, but we were not in power, is something that happens all too often. And I see, feel, and read that public support in Malta. And I've met many courageous people, and the fact that you're still here shows that. And it would be a great tribute to Daphne Caruana Galizia if the last words will turn out to be wrong. Thank you very much.
so optimistic when I heard you mentioning that improving the salary of parliamentarians could be a start of something, could be a start of something. As yet, our two main parties have not really committed to it. Another important aspect which I want to mention is that we should push on the state financing of political parties. Again, a measure that can be introduced tomorrow. These wouldn't be the total solution to Malta's problems, but at least something solid, something concrete, something that can be decided in the short term. Thank you.
The public asks for it. I can say you as an MP, there's nothing more difficult as a politician to raise your own salary or to defend your own. We get, after we resigned, we still have an income for a while. And that's extremely important because you can then resign without actually thinking the next day what happens. And if you normally stand up as a politician and said, I want to double my salary, and by the way, I want to have some more, then you get hammered by the press. So yes, it's an unpopular message, and it would be nice if that would actually come from civil society. And the second thing is true. If you look at Germany, parties get paid there, and you can only blame parties. You can only tell parties not to get any external funding as long as you fund them properly for their own internal research. If you want proper policy plans, then you have to make sure that parties can actually have their institutions, have their long-term thinkers, have their plans made ready, and that's what public money is for. So yes, I would hope that we would, that you would come up for that, yes.
Thank you very much for this talk, and particularly for the personal story and the study and the detail to which you've gone into our life, our island's life. Now, I think you mentioned also at some stage the Russians and other places as well. So I think you're right to say it's a problem of the civilization, and not only European civilization, but in a way global civilization as well. So most of us think that the reason why there's underdevelopment in the world is because there's corruption, especially loans and grants to various governments, time and again have found their way into Swiss bank accounts. My question is this: you mentioned the possibility of international court. I'm not sure I understood you well, but it does seem to me that there is a half set up situation that the United Nations has the rights of individual rights, like the Council of Europe, but not as well developed as the Council of Europe. Now, our first Prime Minister, Borchelever, when he went to the United Nations, 64, he said Malta was in favor of the enforceability of human rights in the United Nations. So I would very much like to suggest that what you've done in Malta is the beginning of something, not the end of something, and that your attitude is very good to help Europe. Malta will help you, and you help Europe, and Europe needs to help the world to get this enforceability. But it must be limited to appealability by your own citizens, not other nations' citizens. It has to be the rights of nations have to be protected, and this is a suggestion which came from John Paul II in the 50th anniversary, that this is the only way to get the United Nations back on its feet.
Okay, thank you.
It's very difficult to get the United Nations back on the field, but what I was referring, yeah, it's very, very difficult.
Yes.
And I think we need a full fight to defend the Council of Europe itself. With all its failings, we see a direct attack, especially from British politics at the moment, on the European Convention on Human Rights. And let me tell me, if you abolish it, you will not be able to re-establish it. And I personally have a problem with getting the human rights overview in the hands of the European Union. Because if the European Union were to be the one that has to say whether laws are in compliance with human rights, then you have to realize that it's now the European Union which makes a majority of laws for the nation states. So if you want to challenge something, whether it's in line or not with basic human rights, like the migration rules of the European Union, then there needs to be a place which is different from the European Union. That's extremely important to defend that. At the moment we see a lot of backsliding. We see that we basically, as the West, we have failed for 30 years to reform part of the United Nations. So the fact that the Western countries do not want to give up a little bit of power in the Security Council, and that we still think that France and the UK have a permanent seat, whereas India doesn't, with the veto power, whereas India doesn't even sit on it, is actually reflecting the power structures of 1950, not the present power structures. So there needs, an enormous amount needs to be done, but the important thing is, do you defend your values or not? And that's where we see the big backsliding. We do not see that democracy actually provides us with the goods it wants to provide. And if that stops, you will see a big backsliding in democracy, and that's the real danger at the moment in a lot of European countries. Now, I could discuss on this for ages, but
Yes.
Is it possible to have a transcript of your speech? For me to now go and discuss with friends, encourage my children, etc., I'm not going to remember a fraction of what you've said, and I think we need to share it.
Yes, we'll send it. We're going to publish it.
Oh, good.
well, that was the second slide. I have seen what happened to whistleblowers, and not only in Malta. If you don't protect the people that raise their voices, then people will not raise their voices. Then you have the choice between raising your voice and paying the few euros it costs. And well, you saw it in the immediate aftermath. You saw it especially in 2019. The ironic thing, obviously, Daphne wrote this piece on the crooks are everywhere. That was a particular court case which 2 years later exploded and led to the protests, which led to the resignations of the Prime Minister. But even then it was impossible. It's very hard. If you want to have a broad movement, you have to have specific ideas. You have to be very specific. I want to change law A, B, and C, and that's going to help you in this way in your daily life. And I see a lot of civil societies which don't get to that level. So make sure it gets across political parties. It's not just on one side of a political system that there is corruption, and the other side there would be zero corruption. And it's not the case that the voters on one side are fed up with it and the other voters are not. So if you find that broad consensus, and that broad consensus can be found. I mean, if you look what happened to a number of the people I've mentioned here, they were attacking me day and night. But they've lost their position in Maltese society step by step.
Don't be too sure of that. They've retreated in political society, but at the moment they are behind the scenes to push new people who are going to still defend their cause.
I know
In Malta, it's not as clear as that, sorry.
it's not just in Malta the way, but the thing politicians like is the public spotlight. And they like to be valued. And not always do they get the same kind of respect from their own followers as they used to get 8 years ago.
Okay, I think we will have to round off the questions for tonight. I would like to thank Mr. Omskit for this really wonderful talk, and I thank him for being here with us. Tomorrow he will be here again. He will be at the memorial. He will be one of the speakers. There will be others, including Beppe Giulietti, who is an Italian journalist who works for the rule of law, and other speakers. Please come and please think of our fundraising because we really need money. Thank you.